إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا من سيئات أعمالنا، من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد, Hijab then goes on to discuss the damage that Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, as he calls it, does to the first premise of his argument, stating that everything that starts to exist has a cause. Okay, the cosmological argument of Al-Ghazali. He contends that it would be begging the question to make that statement in an argument for the existence of God as a cause, when in fact you establish elsewhere in your literature that God is in fact the only true cause for anything in existence at all, which is what he labels as occasionalism, as we pointed out. He forgets, however, that according to the very tradition he has chosen to embrace as a Western debater, this is by no means a defeater for the argument itself. According to the tradition, you start from a point where you don't know anything at all about a creator for this world, and that's exactly what Al-Ghazali does in his cosmological argument. He starts by showing that the world must have begun to exist. Then he looks at the world, observes by proclaimed induction that everything that starts to exist has a cause preceding it. So he generalizes in what some authors have considered a fallacy of composition, as we shall discuss, to judge the world in its entirety as something that must have had a cause to exist, something that must have had a previous cause to bring it into being. And ergo God must have caused it to exist. Okay, that's the argument. Now, according to the Greek tradition he followed here, he is in no pain of begging any question, since at this point he would maintain that he still knows nothing about the attributes of that maker he establishes from that argument. Okay, having established the necessity of a maker in that manner, he would then proceed to examine what attributes are necessary to him, and what meanings are impossible or unacceptable in his regard, according to those notions that he had achieved. In the process, he would establish the oneness of the maker, okay, and then argue that it implies not only that God is the direct cause of the world, coming into being, okay, but of everything in it, establishing that the notion of an intermediate cause implies shirk or polytheism. He would then proceed to establish that the God or the maker that he had proven or had established from his cosmological argument is necessarily a God that must be the single cause for everything to happen in reality, because otherwise it would imply shirk. That's another work that he did in other literature. Now, the fact that Ibn Taymiyyah refutes that occasionalism of his as powerfully and devastatingly as he does has no bearing at all, according to the tradition you ascribe to, Hijab, on the validity of the argument itself, the philosophical validity, or let's say according to the tradition, the use or the value or the worth of the argument in the context of a public debate. There would be no begging the question there, obviously. Okay, why? Because what the argument does is, in fact, that it establishes an abstract philosophical maker that doesn't exist in reality. It only exists in the minds of the arguer, in the mind of the arguer. Okay, what attributes that proclaimed maker does in fact have, or doesn't have, or can or cannot have, is, according to this tradition, another question altogether, which, as we have shown and discussed and explained in other lectures, it's a question that they all fail miserably in addressing, because, as we have shown, the maker that the theistic method in kalam, or the theistic method in theology, ends up proving by these methods and by these means is nothing but an abstract creator that can only be described with negatives and بالسلوب المطلقة, absolute negations, and can only be described and attributed to things that are contradictory. It cannot actually exist outside of the minds of those who are proving it. Okay, so that's a fundamental problem with the method itself. In this context, Hijab was attempting to show that Al-Ghazali's doctrine itself is vulnerable to objections from determinists of modern times. But if by determinism you mean the idea that every event is ultimately determined by preceding causes, direct causes that happened before it, that we can experience in the same manner as we experience the event itself, then Al-Ghazali would easily counter by saying, whoever chose for X to happen when it did must have also determined that it would happen every time with direct correlation to whatever it is you judge as its direct cause, in which case causation would only be shown as his habit, subhanahu, عادته, العادة الإلهية, in making things happen. And indeed, that's how every Ash'ari counters such an objection today. The essence of the refutation is, of course, valid, apart from the sheer fallacy in denying direct causes any true sense of causation or effectiveness as they do. A direct cause is indeed a cause, and it does produce its effect as we experience, due to inherent natures that the Lord keeps installed in things of the world. However, it is He who chooses for those natures to hold as they do, and for their effects to happen as they do, for as long as His will implies. The true essence of the response to determinists thus, in which we would generally agree with Ash'arites, by the way, is to show that His will is necessarily what makes the world the way that it is like. But what is it really like? A world where nothing actually causes anything at all, and it only looks for occasional correlations as though this is the case, or a world where causes do generate their effects following the will of the one who makes a cause and makes an effect an effect. Here is where we would disagree fundamentally with Ash'arites and Ash'ira. Every sensible person would, of course, reject the idea that worldly causes or material causes, as you may label them, are not causes at all, as Ibn Taymiyyah explained proficiently in his literature. The Quran is also replete with descriptions of things happening in the world, following from worldly causes that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ordained for them, as Ibn Taymiyyah also showed. It doesn't follow from something being a true cause, yielding a true effect, from some inherent nature instilled in it, that it should be a partner to the Lord in creating things, as an Ash'arite would maintain. This would only follow from an atheist's metaphysical commitment, where only the natural cause truly exists. Nothing precedes or transcends nature as a complete cause for everything in this world, according to that doctrine. Naturalists, as such, are the ones who would place nature in the seat of God as the ultimate, complete source of all causation. This position, however, does not follow from believing that a natural or material cause is indeed a cause in the true sense of the word cause. Obviously, the causal relationship itself between such a cause and its perceived effect is not rationally necessary. It is contingent in the sense that one can imagine it not holding at all without contradiction. This obviously necessitates a transcendent cause, sabab murajjah, okay, for natural causes holding at all when they do, rather than not. Okay, there are indeed unseen causes beyond those observable ones for every event to take place the way our habit tells us that it does. This is a rational necessity, since there can be no inherent necessity in nature being the way that it is, rather than otherwise. That's how we would refute a naturalist's claim that nature itself is sufficient in explaining why the world is the way that it is, okay, rather than otherwise. All right, and why things exist at all rather than not. We don't need to take the fallacious leap of denying natural causation altogether as Ash'arites would. There is nothing about natural causation that implies natural determinism in the sense I previously mentioned or outlined. A natural cause is every bit a creature as the effect it generates. Okay, it doesn't follow from its being a true cause for created things to come into being that it cannot itself be a creature. Admitting indirect causation does not imply complete causation in nature in that manner. Complete causation in nature. Okay? So if it is fundamentally unjustifiable to dismiss our perception of natural causes as true causes, then how would an Ash'arite who champions such a dismissal refute a Darwinian who claims that our eyes only only fooling us into thinking that living things were indeed created by some willful being who determined for them to be the way that they are rather than otherwise. Okay? If indeed all natural causation, as necessarily true as it really is, it is causation, can be dismissed wholesale metaphysically as just an illusion, then divine creation of living species, as necessarily true as it also is, can equally be dismissed as nothing but a delusion. Any metaphysical claim that challenges basic self-evident beliefs as such is nothing but Greek sophistry, one that the tradition itself would force you to merit as a sensible position. Okay? That can only be refuted by rational arguments and stuff, propositional arguments. Okay? It would follow from the very manner in which a mutakallim argues for his creator that the opponent may indeed be in a potentially valid position when he refutes such arguments wholesale, every single one of them. And guess what? That's exactly what we would get from such debates, of which Hijab is demonstrably quite fond. We would get two giant worldviews, each of which appears to be internally consistent, with absolutely nothing to determine which one is the truth. Indetermination or underdetermination of metaphysical theory is at the very roots of that tradition, as admitted by many of the most adept scholars of Kalam throughout the centuries. If indeed there is no underlying fitra in the subject matter, then both the mutakallim and his opponent are standing on equal theoretical grounds, and no matter how long they would continue to engage in their debates, nobody is going anywhere regarding the truth, regarding of course the truth about the origins of the world and why it came to be at all, rather than otherwise. This is why when Sean Carroll insisted that the third premise in Craig's and Al-Ghazali's argument, the world must have a cause, is only a fallacy of composition in the debate that they had together, a famous debate, analogizing the whole to its parts metaphysically, Craig failed to refute him. On naturalism, you can indeed hold that while every part of the world is constantly changing, with things coming into being from previously existing things and lasting for a while only to perish and change into other things, or other things come into their places, this is not necessarily true of the world itself in its entirety. Okay, this scenario that applies to parts of the world is not necessarily true of the world itself as a whole. According to them, there could have always been an eternal matter in which certain fundamental natures have always abided, causing either an eternal world to have always looked and behaved the way we observe it today, or an eternal world where universes like ours get born, grow, and evolve, and end up perishing in a process of birth and death that has no start and no end, and metaphysically no prior cause, in the same manner that things of this world have preceding causes. In some cases, Craig was indeed forced, as in his debate with the British mathematician Roger Penrose, to allow for an eternal world to have always existed by simply tweaking the definition of cause, what a cause is, to metaphysically include atemporal causes. Okay? He even cited some Christian philosophers who accepted that notion in the church. An atemporal cause is a cause that doesn't precede its effect temporally. It happens simultaneously with its effect. As long as the cause exists, the effect exists as well. This is what Hijab termed here as the emanationist view, like the relationship between the sun and its rays. Craig did find himself at least once in a debate where he would have to resort to such a notion to allow for a certain group of modern cosmological models to be true, while maintaining that the universe was indeed created. Okay, but isn't that precisely why almost every philosopher in the history of the Western Academy, who ever claimed he believed in some maker of the world, would resort to some emanationist position regarding the way an eternal world comes into being? Craig would insist that in such instances he was only arguing that even if an eternal cosmos was true, then it doesn't imply the falsity of his argument. But in a context where knowledge is only taken from such arguments, and the refutations that the opponents raise against them in public debates, What good is any argument at all in determining whether the world was indeed eternal or whether it did in fact have a cause, a preceding cause at all? Whatever, or preceding or otherwise, whatever that word cause itself is taken to mean, that is. Is it okay with you, the mutakallim, that someone would embrace such a belief just as long as they end up submitting to the validity of your particular argument in that particular debate? Yes, brothers and sisters. Sadly, this is what the practice of kalam is all about, following the tradition upon which it was founded originally. Truth of the matter is, we never decided that the world in its entirety must have had a cause that preceded its existence based on some metaphysical argument of this sort, a collective analogy, قياس شمول يعني. Since everything that begins to exist must have a cause, then the world must have had a cause as well. No, we never did that. If indeed it were true that we humans have no innate knowledge whatsoever that our Maker has created everything around us according to His will and His wisdom, then we would be in such a position where such an analogy could potentially be upturned or uprooted by the objection from an entirely different worldview where it would not be necessarily true at all. After all, in every such worldview, justification would not come from some basic rational belief that unless you ascribe to, you could be shown to be lying to yourself and to everybody else, and thereby condemned as a hypocrite. No, it should come according to the Greek tradition from some metaphysical theory about existence by virtue of which you would stand justified. As long as the theory is all-encompassing and self-consistent, you are a holder of some plausible worldview. Otherwise, you are just a blind follower who insists on getting people to agree with you on pain of a heavy social accusation of lying to themselves and denying the undeniable. After all, in such a context, your opponent would have every right to claim that his conclusion is necessarily true as you do, which is why I've shown that rational necessity is only contextual force in this tradition. A social necessity really, nothing more. X is necessarily true if and only if, it has to be so for the metaphysical theory I choose to embrace to provide me with any plausible claims about reality as a whole, or for the benefit of showing myself as the superior intellect in the room in a public debate, which is usually pretty much the same. Thereby, while in debate A, X may be taken to be necessarily true, in another debate B, by the same debater, it could easily be disputed, the very same X, or even dismissed altogether. Yes, we do concede, of course, that some notions are necessarily true for some people, while other people would need to obtain previous knowledge to be able to admit that they are. However, the point I'm raising here is that in the Greek tradition, all beliefs and claims about reality are theoretical, by nature, in the sense that no matter how clear or self-evident anybody claims them to be, it remains plausible in principle that some people may fail to see them as such and thus should be excused for rejecting them. Or that perhaps in the future somebody would come up with a theory that would upturn them altogether, that would compel us to let go of them and accept other facts or other claims. We do not for a minute accept this stance. And as it stands, the fact that the world in its entirety has had a willful creator is indeed much clearer and much more obvious than the fact that everything that started to exist must have had a cause, or even that the world at large must have started to exist in the past. Each of these facts is a self-evident fact, of course, too clear to require argumentation or theoretical justification, but some are more readily clear and self-evident than others, objectively speaking. So to allow, in methodological terms, for claim A to be a premise in some propositional argument of analogy, along with B, devised to prove the validity of C, should allow the exact same theoretical skepticism to be raised against both A and B all the same, with no force whatsoever to compel anybody to admit anything or to accuse anybody of denying the obvious. جحد الوضحات يعني. If you've granted that C might require theoretical argumentation of some sort for some people to accept it, while admitting that other people don't need such arguments at all, and in fact claim it to be self-evident and a basic belief, then you are required By the same token, to allow for both A and B to continue to be theoretically unclear or demanding for theoretical argumentation, propositional argumentation, or analogy, to prove them true for some people all the same. Okay, in which case, you would have no right at all to end some debate with the claim that denying A or B, whatever they may be, amounts to denying an objectively necessary and self-evident truth. No such thing would be an ending point for debate. Okay, if someone truly needs theory in this respect, then they actually need someone to show them the falsity and absurdity of an opposing position by clarifying its entailments in the manner we've done in this lecture, refuting presenting a rational refutation for the claim that no natural cause is a true cause. Okay, that's a recent example that I just did here. We didn't need to establish some metaphysical theory of causation to define what can amount as a cause and what cannot, okay, and thereby show by analogy that what appears to be a material cause is indeed a true cause. We didn't do that. Rather, we resorted to defeating and ridiculing the metaphysical theory that the Ash'arites uphold in defining causation in principle, by showing how senseless, rationally and linguistically, denying inherent natures in things and their effects on other material things really is, and of course by showing how it implies rejecting much of the Quran. This is theoretical work in the sense that we provide what can amount to premises in establishing results. We argue rationally for certain results. Okay? Those results, however, are categorically different from what philosophers seek to establish by arguments in a manner that I hope must have been made quite clear by now. We're not addressing those people on the implicit assumption that they don't know what a cause is, or what the word cause actually means, or that they need to have it defined in advance. No, we're addressing someone who is supposed objectively to already know what the word cause means in normal linguistic use by showing them the absurdity of that theory that they adhere to and how it contradicts that very meaning that every sensible person is supposed to admit. Once you've shown a certain metaphysical claim to be absolutely absurd in this manner, okay, and unacceptable, then you would leave its holders no grounds to even suggest denying the undeniable truth in its favor. You would be justified then in shaming them if they insist on doing so. And that's precisely how the hujjah of the Quran is established upon those addressed by it, the argument of the Quran. The Quran is not suggesting or proposing a theory of existence in opposition to another theory. It's defeating and ridiculing every theoretical assumption that opposes the clear truth that it builds upon. Anyone who has ever read it, who knows Arabic and has no previous commitments to some school of Kalami thought, would readily admit this. It's not a book of philosophy or Kalam. No, it's a book of guidance and wisdom by the Creator of all things, who knows what psychological reasons his creatures would have to reject the undeniable truth, and who thus addresses them with exactly what they need to hear. And because it doesn't address people in keeping with the Greek tradition of metaphysical argumentation, philosophers and mutakallimun alike have sought to reinterpret some of its arguments and its terms in a manner that would show it to have actually presented arguments for the existence of the Maker in the same manner they have committed themselves to. Ibn Sina, for example, famously claimed that the word al-afilin, those things that set, as in the sun setting, al-afilin, means contingent things, which of course it doesn't. But why did he do that? Because it would be such a shame that the Quran doesn't even represent a single philosophical argument from existence, coexistence, according to the Greek tradition that has come to define all reason and rationality in their belief, while they're doing everything in their power to show that the Maker they argue for in their debates with other philosophers is indeed the same Maker that the Quran is teaching about. Okay? The Quran doesn't by any means argue from metaphysical premises for the existence of the Maker. It rather chides and chastises those who choose to deny his existence, shaming them for the absurdities that such a position would entail. So is it actually calling on to people to admit his existence without proof? According to the Greek tradition, that's what it would look like it's doing. If they fail to show the book, to show the Quran, to have presented some metaphysical arguments for his existence somewhere, somehow. Now, how does it not start by establishing through some philosophical proof that the world in its entirety is indeed contingent or has begun to exist, and thereby entailing the existence of a necessary maker. How? Are you inviting us to a religion that is rationally lacking, or that shames people for rejecting something they have no rational reasons to accept? No rational reasons, rational according to the tradition, of course. Okay? Unless it offers them such reason in a manner that leaves no room for rational objection, then it has no right whatsoever to rebuke those who reject it, or treat it as yet another book of human origins. That's why those committed to that tradition of establishing knowledge about the unseen, would find themselves necessarily committed as well to doing all manners of forced, warped interpretation of scripture to show that the Quran did in fact provide such a rational reason as grounds for its case. Okay. Abraham, for example, must be shown to have been arguing in the Quran to establish his own knowledge of the existence of a maker from contingency, if that's your metaphysical theory, or from eventuality, al-huduth, if that's your theory of choice. No heed should be paid whatsoever to how the Salaf, the apostles and their immediate students, understood that story in the Quran, or how they accepted the case that the Quran addressed them with. They themselves accepted the case. The Greek tradition in the theory of knowledge necessitates that the Quran should argue in that manner, because otherwise it wouldn't meet with the academic standards of rationality. Rather, it would be inviting people to commit blind following in faith, taqleed fil iman. So while the cosmological argument from causation falls short in what it is supposed to do, it doesn't do so because Al-Ghazali embraced occasionalism with respect to causation. No, it fails because of the underlying theory of knowledge that it presupposes, because of the Greek tradition of argument and debate it caters to. The same tradition that Hijab is fostering here, claiming Ibn Taymiyyah to have endorsed one way or another. The tradition that made it a rational obligation for all believers in a creator worthy of worship to establish his existence on metaphysical demonstrations about existence in his very principle. Al-Ghazali's metaphysical theory of causation, occasionalism, does inflict the Ash'ari doctrine as a whole with rational inconsistency and internal incoherence, of course. You start by arguing that induction teaches you that everything that starts to be has a cause, which is true, of course, although the principle of causation is a rationally necessary component of the very meaning of an event, hadith, in the sense that we don't need to induce from our experience for the purpose of learning that it is true. Nobody ever does that. But that's what you do. Then you end up believing that all those induced causes are in fact not causes at all. Not causes at all. Merely occasional correlations, okay, not causes. Okay. So where does that leave you with respect to the first premise? Inconsistency, of course. However, this is not the only problem with the doctrine of proving the existence of the creator through metaphysical theories. This is only one outcome of the fundamental methodological problem with the tradition itself. Another more important outcome would be the corruption of the very notion of huduth, mafhum al-huduth itself, the notion of happening, of beginning to exist, under the metaphysical theory upon which the claim that the world began to exist as in premise 2 was founded in such an argument. Alright? The class of existing things that is dubbed metaphysically as hawadith is simultaneously everything that begins to exist and everything that must have had an external entity causing it to begin to exist. Alright? The logic of the theory starts by classifying all existing things in reality in two distinct classes. Things that began to exist, al-hadith or al-hawadith, and things that exist without a beginning, al-qadim. Right? The received metaphysical doctrine of the time was Aristotle's explanation of the reason why all things existing in reality have the distinct attributes that they have in our knowledge. They have those attributes, according to Aristotle, because they are all composed, murakkaba, of two distinct types of things. A substance, al-jawhar, which is something that exists without any attributes, and an accident, al-arad, which is something that gives a substance all its attributes. Alright? Everything that has attributes, sifat, as such, must be a composition of both these claimed components. This implies, obviously, that everything that happens at all, everything that begins to be, does so only because it is an accident, arad, according to that doctrine. Okay? So if you're someone who embraces that doctrine, and yet you wish to show that the world as a whole must have begun to exist in the past, what would you do? You would show by induction that if all things of the world are such that they must have attributes that make them distinguishable from other things of the world, then they are all things composed from substance and accident. However, if A, every single thing in the world must have begun to be the way that it is at some point in time, then does it follow that B, the whole world that is entirely, must have begun to exist at some point in the past? Obviously not. B alone does not entail A. Perhaps it's always been the case that the world is such that every now and then parts of it would perish, only for new parts to come into existence in their place. In that case, it would be conceivable that while every existing thing in the world has had a beginning in itself, the world itself is without a beginning, which is precisely what naturalists and most philosophers believe. So how do we prove that the whole world must have had a beginning? Okay, Al-Ghazali, as well educated in Greek philosophy as he was, decided that the only way around that hurdle was to show that the very notion of happening as a result of there being accidents combined with substances in the theory must have had a starting point in the past, in principle, before which nothing can be said to have happened at all. Okay? In other words, a starting point for all things that start to exist. Okay? He figured that if he managed to prove that accidents cannot have been happening from eternity past, then he would effectively prove that the world, as the metaphysical class of all things that started to exist, of all accidents, is not without a beginning itself. Doing so, he would establish premise 2 in a way that entails, together with premise 1, the conclusion that the world must have had a cause that cannot itself be a being that started to exist in time, because if it were, then it would be yet another accident of the world that requires an external cause for it to come into being. Okay? Thus, he resorted to an argument by some ancient philosophers that repeating things cannot have actually regressed in the past without a beginning, since if they did, then there would be no way for a later thing to happen, since then its turn to happen would never come. That's the reasoning here. That is, if we assumed that there was never any starting point for all accidents, then the very notion of an accident happening after another one would be impossible. Why? Because as the argument goes, in order for the later to happen, all the earlier ones should have come to pass before it, but the assumption here is that they are infinitely many. Infinitely many. So how could it come to pass that something comes to happen afterwards? Okay. Now, while this reasoning might seem to be flawless and irrefutable, it is indeed a fallacy of projection. The argument commits the same sophistry that Parmenides committed when he argued that motion can only be an illusion. Nothing can in fact be moving at all. How did he come to that preposterous claim? By maintaining that in order for anything to move from one point to another, one can envision an infinite series of points between these two, through which it would have to pass before it reaches its destination. Thus he concluded that no matter how long it keeps moving from one of these points to the next, it would never reach its destination. Alright? Or at least never as fast as it would appear to be moving in our perception. Now, the line of reasoning he took appears just as appealing and compelling as the one that Al-Ghazali adopted here. Yet it commits the exact same fallacy, brothers and sisters. Obviously, things do move in reality, right? No sane, self-respecting individual would dispute this fact. So, what exactly went wrong? What's going on here? The fallacy, brothers and sisters, comes from projecting an epistemic limit upon the ontology of the world, thereby facing a false limit unto reality as it is. A false limit, a limit that only exists upon knowledge of the world, not upon the world itself. Yes, we can, in principle, divide the distance between any 2 points into an infinite number of zero length instances, or let's say lengths tending to zero, to use the algebraic term, as a zero distance means, of course, that no distance would be traversed at all between any 2 points, which defeats the very notion of division, obviously. Now, obviously, no matter how long anybody spent in attempt to count how many such distances a moving body would have to traverse through, even when moving for a distance as short as a few centimeters, they would never manage to count them all. And since there can conceivably be a shorter distance than even the shortest distance you can imagine, halving every half, as Zeno's famous example would propose, then we are practically demanding a count that can never be completed, never be achieved. But obviously, things do move in reality, at whatever speeds they move at, traversing all such possible divisions in our minds with no limitation from the mere fact that we cannot even begin to count them. What this shows, brothers and sisters, is that countability or limitedness in our knowledge is not a rational condition for things to repeat in reality. Things may indeed have repeated in the past, regardless of whether they repeated for a countable number of times or not. The idea that repetition must be countable or limited in order for it to have happened at all in reality is nothing but a fallacy of projection. The objection that if infinite things have happened in the past before A, then A would never come to pass is only valid if we assume a certain point after which infinite events should come to pass before it is time for A to take its turn. Yes, indeed, in that case, there would be no way for A to happen at all. But assuming this to be the case with the very principle of any actual past infinity would be yet another mental projection that has no bearing in reality whatsoever. We can conceive of an infinite extension of instances of time in the past where every past moment had countless moments before it, just as we can imagine an infinite extension of time in the future where every future moment has countless moments to follow after. Okay? It's the same. In fact, this is precisely what we mean when we say the Creator is eternal. The Creator Himself, subhanahu wa ta'ala, is eternal. He must have existed such that at any given moment in the past, at any past in the time, no matter how far back we go, He had existed before that. Okay? No matter how far back you go in the past. Go to any point you choose in the past or in the future, no matter how far, you would still be able to claim that countless other points preceded in His lifespan and countless other points will come next. Yes, you will not be able to say that this or that moment comes after X moments or comes at the point number X, okay, in a sequence, if you wish to count all the moments that preceded it in the past, and by moment here I mean a fixed span of time, obviously, measured by the motion of the sun relative to the earth or by any standard unit of repeated motion that you choose. Okay, you will be able to do that counting, but an uncountable quantity is simply that, uncountable. Okay, why would that make it impossible for it to have happened at all? It wouldn't. The only rational condition for a later event to come to pass is for any countable number of events it is termed later with respect to have all come to pass before it. Event A would merit the description as a later event with respect to B if and only if it happened before A. B happened before A. Okay? If, however, event A can only happen as a direct result or consequence of a series of events happening before it, wherein every event depends entirely causally on the one before it, then that series cannot be infinite, since then we would have an infinite regress of necessary and sufficient causes, which is rationally impossible. No infinite regress of complete causes could have come to pass in reality for any event A, because then the dependence of A on previous causes would be rendered ultimately baseless, unreal. You cannot say then that A and all its causes before it happened because of X, in which case there would be no ultimate cause for A or any of its causes to happen, leaving it in effect uncaused. And that's a contradiction. Imagine a tower of bricks where every brick rests on the one beneath it. If we assume that that tower has no brick that can be called the lowest bottom brick underneath, then the entire load-bearing process for the tower would not happen at all. Okay, for the entire tower of bricks, nothing would bear anything. The Ash'arites, however, would give this as an example to show that infinite regress of past events as such is impossible. Infinite regress in general to exist in reality is impossible. They also commonly give another example to demonstrate the proclaimed absolute impossibility of infinite regress of past events, where they would say, suppose I said I will never give you a coin unless I have given you one before it. Then obviously I will never give you anything. Obviously I will never give you any coins at all. Now clearly giving a coin here is entirely dependent by way of necessary condition on having given one before it, having given a previous one. So unless the process starts with one coin that doesn't fall under that strict condition, the series itself can never happen, obviously. So this is actually yet another example of an infinite regress of unattainable conditions, as described, just as in the case of infinite regress of complete causes. Okay? It does not show in any way that an actual regress of past events is generally impossible. All the examples and the demonstrations given by the Ash'arites fail for similar reasons. Okay? They fall flat on the face. They falsely generalize the undeniable impossibility of regress of past dependencies. تسلسل العلل they show it, they generalize it to include all actual regresses in the past, and that's not acceptable. That's simply a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. Okay? Alright. Now the problem with Al-Ghazali's metaphysical system, brothers and sisters, is that it implies a maker that not only has no attributes at all, but one that cannot even have indeed been a maker of anything at all. Since the Aristotelian doctrine teaches that all meanings that distinguish any existing things in reality from other existing things in reality are due to them being composed of two abstract components that have been put together one way or another, and that the very notion of hadith, an event, is thus nothing but an instance of a state of one of those two components, the accident, al-arad, then it follows that no deeds can be attributed to anything that is not thus composed, including the creation of the world itself, since a deed is necessarily an event, hadith. Saying something did X, or someone did X, gives the exact same meaning as saying the event of someone doing X has happened. The event of someone doing X happened. Okay? A deed is necessarily something that starts to happen and is necessarily attributed to its doer, not to someone else. So according to the doctrine, it cannot be attributed to the maker of all things that have come to exist, in which case he cannot be said to have made anything at all, least of all the world. This is not only the reason why he cannot be called the maker of the world in Al-Ghazali's metaphysics. Nothing could have created the world, because in order for something to create something else, it has to have existed before it in time. Okay, but it follows from his stance on actual past regress that nothing could have existed at all before the start of the world, since there can actually be no before at that point. No past time in which it can be said that the Creator existed before he created the world, and in which he started creating it after his will, and so it came to be after it was not there. That kind of statement should have no meaning at all in that doctrine, on that doctrine. Okay, on that metaphysics. A tenseless or a temporal existence outside of time is nothing but a philosophical fallacy. If it exists at all in reality, then it is there now, at the present moment, in time, and in a place relative to other things that exists now as well, not outside of time or before time itself. Okay, no existence of an actual entity in reality outside of the mind can be conceived of existing outside of time, or atemporally, or tenselessly, as they would term it. So what an Ash'ari would call an eternal existence, wujud azali, is not in fact the state of the eternal al-qadim existing before the world, with no starting point in time for its existence, as every Muslim would understand. No, but rather the state of existing in no time at all, or before time itself, which, as we've demonstrated, is actually not just a state of non-existence, but of impossible existence, wujud mumtani'. On that doctrine, the world cannot have had a beginning in time, because it is time itself that starts with the proclaimed creation. And nothing can be eternal in the way that every sensible person understands the word eternal to mean. Something existing outside of time would be an impossible entity that cannot have any deeds or actions attributed to it at all. Creation cannot have happened thus. So at the end of the day, we're left again with a world that cannot have had a point in time where it never existed, or where it was in fact created. And that's i.e. an eternal world. And an alleged maker that is nothing but a deistic maker that cannot have any attributes at all, as a thing existing in reality outside of the mind before it allegedly created the world, and that is currently superfluous with attributes given to him that he cannot actually have. Given to him that he cannot actually have. Okay? Thus, a mutakallim, brothers and sisters, from any doctrine of kalam, ought to understand that these kinds of atheistic implications are not specific to one metaphysical theory in particular rather than another. They are characteristic of the very tradition of starting from forging some metaphysical theory in establishing any meaningful beliefs about the reality or about the unseen, as taught by the fathers of the Greek Academy, and are a necessary fruit of the sophist theory of knowledge that the tradition adopts. Hijab then proceeds to say, another subject of inquiry is Al-Ghazali's suspicion of Messina's modal categories as being relevant to the real world. Regarding this, Griffel states that Al-Ghazali questions the assumption of an ontological coherence between this world and our knowledge of it. Certain predictions, which for Avicenna apply to things in the real world, apply for Al-Ghazali only to human judgments. Okay, now Hijab comments saying, this suspicion is concurrent with the Kantian objection to the ontological argument. It cannot be reasoned, however, that Al-Ghazali did not believe in possibility and necessity as existing in the real world, for he and the Ash'arites that preceded him made an argument from particularization, as explained by Griffel, الترجيح يعني. Then he goes on to quote that author and comment on his ideas as though it really matters to anyone who is not like Hijab trying to hunt for some academic position next to that author himself, what that man thinks. Okay, who on earth is that Griffel anyway, and why does it matter to Muslims or even to atheists of the world, for that matter, what he thinks about Al-Ghazali's thought? we don't care. Look at him trying to make himself relevant in every way that he can to the literature of the modern Academy of Philosophy, even if just by passing a statement where he likens Kant's reasons for objecting to the ontological argument with Al-Ghazali's reasons for suspecting that Ibn Sina's division does apply to the real world. What are we required to do now, taking such a notice as seriously as any student of the Academy should? Go spend years reading and investigating Kant's thought after, of course, having spent the same years or more studying Al-Ghazali's legacy in order to be able to provide that academy with a novel contribution on the comparison between both systems of thought, Al-Ghazali's and Kant's, on this issue and in other areas? Or of what worth or value would such a study be to a Muslim or to anybody else for that matter? That academy, brothers and sisters, which Hijab is trying so hard with everything he can to be an esteemed part of, is not an academy where research queries and are generated on the grounds of actual practical benefit or religious worth for a Muslim or even for a non-Muslim. It's an academy where the texts of pioneering philosophers are treated as though they were divine scripture that ought to be understood as deeply and accurately as possible, as long as they have many followers, those philosophers, of course. Okay, not for the sake of making the world a better place, objectively speaking, no, but for the sake of turning a sophomore student in that academy into a professor or an expert in whatever field they choose to study, in whatever philosopher he chooses to study. You can actually become a scholar of Kant if you're so inclined. Become an authority on interpreting Kantian text and selecting what you claim to be the right or proper theory in presenting Kant's philosophy. Okay, in a cesspool of theories that followers of that philosopher have come up with throughout the centuries since his death in understanding his legacy. It's such a sad state of affairs, really, that someone who claims to be a Muslim preacher, a Salafi preacher for that matter, is seeking a seat in that academy. Who cares what Kant really wanted to say in some ambiguous portion of his texts? Are we harboring some belief in his infallibility, for example? Is it such that if we failed to properly comprehend everything that he said in his books, we would fail the very purpose of our existence in this world, as would be the case with religious scripture? The point here, brothers and sisters, is that this man, Muhammad Hijab, is not judging what he writes in such a book by the standards of our deen, the standards of a true student of religious sciences. No, rather he's judging it by the standards of the modern Western Academy of Philosophy of Religion. If that's what a professional philosopher of religion is expected to write, to showcase his merits in the field, then that's what he would write, okay, in such a book. I know about Kant's position with respect to X, and I also know that it's concurrent with Al-Ghazali's views on X. I'm writing this for no other reason but to demonstrate this fact, to show that I have spent quite some time reading in Western philosophical literature to come to such a conclusion. Okay, so I'm every bit as merited to be addressing you people as I do. That's the only benefit anybody would reap from such a statement in such a context. He's not inviting his reader to do like he did or to study Kant like he did. No, it's not even a statement that would make any difference to any benefit that this book itself is supposed to provide. He's only making a statement of qualification in the field, a statement of merit, of eligibility. This is me, this is what I know, this is what I've read. Okay, that's all that this book is about, really. To be a public debater who has published books in Western philosophy of religion and have engaged, indeed, academically with key players in that field is of course more worthy of social consideration and appreciation where he lives than just being a Muslim preacher who happens to engage in public debates every now and then on the YouTube or elsewhere. There is a profound difference, Hijab, between identifying the obvious self-evident meaning and embracing a metaphysical classification of existing things in reality that builds upon that meaning. That there are indeed contingent things in reality that could, rationally speaking, have not existed at all or could have existed differently from the way they are known to exist is a rational necessity, of course, and is by all means a self-evident fact, a basic belief, so to speak. However, the same cannot be said of a metaphysical theory that divides all existing things in reality or categorizes them into two distinct classes. The class of all contingent things that cannot exist without an external cause or a preponderator, or a being with will who determines which of the countless possible states of being for those things will obtain in reality, and the class of necessary things that are not contingent and cannot be described by meanings of contingency whatsoever, and are the ones that do that preponderation and determination for contingent things. It is because of that classification, brothers and sisters, that Ibn Sina committed all his errors and fallacies and falsities that we explained in previous lectures. It is not by any means a classification that should be treated as self-evident or even as valid or plausible in describing all of existence. It's the Greek tradition of metaphysical sophistry at its finest. It's what philosophers are trained to do if they wish to forge a place for themselves in the halls of that academy. Start from studying existence in its very principle, put forth some explanatory categorization of all existing things in reality by means of some analogy, and then proceed from the bottom up, building all of knowledge upon that. So having suspicions about such a categorization as that of Ibn Sina is not at all the same thing as doubting the rational necessity of there being contingent things that I previously expressed. The problem presents itself strikingly when you submit yourself to the philosopher's traditional commitment to explaining the existence of everything that abides in reality as such, employing analogies that can only apply within the scope of our limited experience. The query that philosophers tackle is simply way too big for the rational tools we humans employ in investigating things that we experience in our daily lives. No philosopher in that academy would be willing to admit that obvious fact and to truly embrace what it entails, because philosophy, brothers and sisters, is not a practice that was born historically of humility and honesty with respect to one's place in the world. No, it was rather born of arrogance and self-righteousness and an endeavor to bring everyone to submit to oneself and to follow, the way that people follow prophets. So it is no wonder that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would lead them so far astray that even a little child who understands much of what they propose would fall on his back laughing at them, and would be every bit justified in doing so. A contingent thing can only be preponderated by a necessary thing. Fine, that's a necessary truth. Granted. However, that classification implies the Avicenna's classification implies that the very act of preponderation itself be a contingent thing, since it can be imagined not to have happened at all, obviously, right? So can it actually be attributed to a necessary being according to that classification? No, it cannot, because then the necessary being would need yet another necessary being to preponderate the state of it preponderating a contingent thing. You see? Remember that the classification defines a contingent thing as anything that requires something else, some distinct existing thing in reality to make it the way that it is, rather than otherwise. But if we assumed that other thing itself to have contingent realities attributed to it, then it will accordingly require yet another existing thing to determine it, on pain of infinite regress. So what's the way out? Maintaining that the necessary existence can be nothing at all but just that, the abstract notion of necessary existence that we find in our minds, period. Because otherwise the classification would entail a regress that defeats the very notion of necessary things from the word go. So what does all that come down to? A theory where contingent things are the way they are rather than otherwise, not because some real entity outside of our minds determined by its actual will that they should be the way that they are rather than otherwise. No, but because we find in our minds an absolute notion of necessary being. That's it. In our minds, not in reality. comprehend this folly the way it needs to be comprehended, brothers and sisters, and you will definitely fall on your backs laughing at it, and rightfully so. And if you do, you wouldn't need to study Kant or to study Al-Ghazali's reasons for suspecting it to hold true in the real world. You will have known by the grace of Allah alone subhanahu wa ta'ala where the Greek legacy is supposed to be placed and what we Muslims should be making of it. Wallahu musta'an wa la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.